Lessons on the Last Supper. The Last Supper. This is the time when Jesus met with the 12 and had the Passover meal. This is the time that Jesus washed the disciples' feet, and we've already covered that. And now it comes time for them to eat the Passover together. And we'll talk about some of the things that happened and how, as we read last week, Jesus loved his own to the end. And he loved them so much that he showed them about servanthood and washing their feet. And now he's very, very anxious by design to eat the Passover meal with his 12. Just a few short hours before he is betrayed by Judas and then taken off to trial. And yes, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all cover aspects of the last week, and we could go back and forth, and a lot of it is duplicative. But we're going to start with Luke chapter 22, and we'll read a little bit there and talk about it, and then we'll go to John 13 in just a moment as well. This is Luke 22. Let's read the first 13 verses, please. Now the festival of the unleavened bread, called the Passover, was approaching. And the chief priests and teachers of the law were looking for some way to get rid of Jesus, for they were afraid of the people. Then Satan entered Judas, called Iscariot, one of the 12. And Judas went to the chief priests and the officials of the temple guard and discussed with them how he might betray Jesus. They were delighted and agreed to give him money. He consented and watched for an opportunity to hand Jesus over to them when no crowd was present. Then came the day of unleavened bread, on which the Passover lamb had to be sacrificed. Jesus sent Peter and John, saying, "Go and make preparations for us to eat the Passover." "Where do you want us to prepare for it?" they asked. He replied, "As you enter the city, a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him to the house that he enters, and say to the owner of the house, 'The teacher asked, where is the guest room where I may eat the Passover with my disciples?' He will show you a large room upstairs, all furnished, and make preparations there." They left and found things just as Jesus had told them, and so they prepared the Passover. Most of us understand, I think, the idea of Passover. But let's remember that this was the most important feast day of the Jewish people. And they were to come to Jerusalem if possible. And at this time, Jerusalem was packed with people, thousands of people here for Passover. And they had a week ahead of time for them to have this festival of unleavened bread. They were not supposed to eat any leavened bread for 7 days, and then they had the Passover meal. And as we know, this was to commemorate the time that Moses led the children of Israel out of Egyptian bondage. And we know that story, how Moses was God's leader. He went up against the Egyptian Pharaoh. And we know the story of the 10 plagues that God visited upon Egypt to try to convince Pharaoh to let the people go. It didn't work until the very last one, when God killed the firstborn of all the Egyptians. And to signify the separation from the Egyptians to the Jews, God said, now on this night that this is going to happen, you take a unblemished lamb, about a year old, and you kill it, and you take the blood and you smear some blood over the door frame of your house, and you eat the flesh, and you eat it with bitter herbs, and you remember that I will pass over your house. When I come, the angel of death, or whatever it's called, come tonight to kill the firstborn of the Egyptians. When I see the blood over your doorpost, your entryway, I will pass over that house. And that's how the term Passover started. And this was so significant because this was God's hand in history. With a mighty hand, God led Israel out of Egypt. That's repeated many, many times in the Old Testament, the mighty hand of God. And so they remembered this every year. And they had unleavened bread, and originally they were told that night of the Passover in Egypt, now you get dressed and you get your shoes on and get your belt tight and get things loaded, because you're going to go tonight. You're going to go. And so when you eat this meal, you eat it in haste, knowing that things are going to happen fast. And I think the significance of the unleavened was that they didn't have time to bread rise, and so that was sort of again an indication of the urgency of what God wanted them to do that night. So that's why the Passover, even to this day, is unleavened bread. Okay. Now, Jesus wants to do this with his 12 before he dies. Now, the festival of Passover was such a big deal in Jerusalem that there was buzz around. You may remember from reading in Scripture. You think Jesus is going to show up for this? You know, he's off sort of in the hinterlands and don't know if he's going to show. And of course, the Jewish leaders, the Pharisees, were looking for him and watching for him. And sure enough, Jesus did come to Jerusalem. This was his plan, as we know, to die. And he locked horns with these great Pharisaical Jewish leaders. We've read that. And now the tension builds to the Passover meal. The last time he's with his 12. And things are prepared, and we just read that Judas went to the Jewish leaders to try to make an arrangement to tip them off on how they could capture Jesus off to the side without the crowds being around. Because we've read also already that the crowds believed in Jesus. The crowds supported Jesus. Jesus was their hero. He was with them. And the Pharisees knew that they'd have a riot on their hands if they didn't do things right in trying to get rid of Jesus. And of course, if there was a revolt, a riot, the Roman government would come in and squash things, and they didn't want that. So Judas does this. Now, we've been asked many times, didn't Jesus know that Peter was going to deny him and Judas was going to betray him when he chose the 12? Yes, of course. This was God's plan. And I've had people ask me, why did Jesus let this happen? Didn't he know about Judas? Well, yes. But this was the plan of God, step by step, to do this for us. Jesus knew all along that Judas was going to do this. Jesus even washed Judas's feet, we saw last week. Now, it says here that, as we just read, Passover was about there, and Satan entered into Judas, and Judas went to the chief priests and officials and discussed how he might betray Jesus. They were very happy about that and worked out a deal. Now, we might ask, was Was Judas lured into this by maybe a ransom or a bounty on Jesus' head, as we would say? No, we have no indication of that at all. We have no indication that, the word had gone out that we'll pay anybody, 30 pieces of silver if they'll tip us off on where Jesus might be. We don't see that at all. They didn't have a Crime Stopper reward, dangling out here. If anybody knows anything about this guy, here's a reward. You can remain anonymous. Just call this number, and we'll give you 30 pieces of silver and all that. We don't have any indication of that. Judas went to them and said, I can help you guys out because I'm with Jesus. I can get you to him in a private way. So let's never think that Judas was entrapped or tempted by anything other than his own wickedness and, of course, the work of Satan in his heart. Now, we see that the day of unleavened bread was coming up. Jesus sent his two, Peter and John, to go get a room prepared for the Passover. This was a monumental task. Why? Because every room in town had been booked up, I'm sure. There were thousands upon thousands of people there, and every room was taken, and it was just a sea of people. But Jesus says, I want you to go to town and prepare for it. And they said, well, how do we do that? He said, well, you're going to go to town, and you're going to see a guy carrying a jar of water, and you follow this guy where he goes to that house, and then you say, where's your room? And it's going to be upstairs, and you go there, and everything's going to be okay. It's going to be ready. And that's exactly what happened. Now, a guy carrying a jar of water, what does that mean? Nothing much, except that normally the women would be doing this. And it would have been odd to see a man doing this. And so that was a tip-off. And sure enough, Peter and John did that, and they prepared the Passover. It's very likely Jesus had made this arrangement ahead of time with this landowner here, or the householder here. Don't know who he was, he or she, whatever, we don't know. But it seems to be more than just happenstance. Yes, God could have done anything. But it seems that probably maybe Jesus had arranged for this earlier, for the time for them to be alone in an upper room together. And this is significant. Jesus was anticipating this very, very much. All right, let's turn to John chapter 13. Let me pause that. Yes, sir. Go ahead.
The longer you walk the Christian walk, the phrases "good luck," "coincidence,"
yes.
Fade away.
Yes.
And this one monumental event, he ties all of his people together. The Jews at Passover, the Christians at Easter.
Yes. Yes.
One ties them together forever.
Yes. Yes. Our heritage of our supper that we'll take in a few minutes is the Passover meal. Yes. Anything else? All right, John chapter 13. We'll start about verse 21 as we read, and then we'll talk about it a little bit. Jesus had been talking about who was going to betray him a little bit, and made some references there. So beginning in verse 21 of John 13, Jesus, it says here, and after he'd said this, Jesus was troubled in spirit and testified, very truly I tell you, one of you is going to betray me. And his disciples stared at one another, at a loss to know which of them he meant. One of them, the disciple whom Jesus loved, which would be John, was reclining next to him. Simon Peter motioned to this disciple and said, "Ask him which one he means." Leaning back against Jesus, he asked him, "Lord, who is it?" Jesus answered, "It is the one to whom I will give this piece of bread when I have dipped it in the dish." Then, dipping the piece of bread, he gave it to Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot. And as soon as Judas took the bread, Satan entered into him. So Jesus told him, "What you are about to do quickly." But no one at the meal understood why Jesus said this to him. Since Judas had charge of the money, they thought Jesus was telling him to buy what was needed for the festival or to give something to the poor. And as soon as Judas had taken the bread, he went out, and it was night. This is a very intriguing situation that we'll see here, and it's disturbing. I know Sue even asked about it last week, how all this sort of worked together. We'll see if we can look at it a little bit more. Jesus had just washed the disciples' feet, and now they had begun the evening meal here, the Passover meal. And Jesus is very stressed, and he says, "One of you will betray me." And this set off the other 11, I guess, because Judas obviously knew who he was talking about. But you see the glances and the puzzled looks and the wondering about, what does he mean? To betray me? Well, what does that mean? Well, of course, we know now, looking back, but at that time, they didn't quite know what Jesus was meaning when he said, somebody's going to betray me. Sort of not speak up for me, or maybe not be nice to me, or maybe tell something bad about me behind my back, or how was this betrayal going to happen, and what did it mean? And so the disciple whom Jesus loved, which was John, which was writing this, he doesn't say, so-and-so came to me and said this, but he says, the one whom Jesus loved, the writer John, said, and Peter sort of motioned to him, hey, ask him, who is this? And so Peter does. Now, the term is used sort of reclining at table. When they ate in those days, they really didn't have a good chair and table like we do and sit down and all that. They had a low table, and they sort of got down on their knees, sat down, and from what I could figure out, just knowing how we do, we get tired of, sitting down, so we sort of lean on this arm for a while and maybe eat, and then we sort of maybe lean on this arm for a while and eat, drink, whatever. I think that's probably what they were doing as they were sort of reclining at table, as the phrase goes. And so John was right next to Jesus, and Peter says, ask him who it is. And so John does. And Jesus says, the one who I give this piece of bread to after I sop it in the dish is the one. And he gave it to Judas. And it says that Satan, entered into Judas's heart at that time. Just go do it, get over with. Jesus says, do it quickly. But it says clearly in verse 28, no one understood what this meant. Some thought, well, maybe Jesus was telling them to just go ahead and get out of here and take care of the money things, if we need to buy something, whatever. And anyway, Judas did leave. Now, when we think about what happened here, we have to understand that their customs were a a little different than ours. First of all, no meal was considered to be complete without bread. That was their base, where they started everything was their bread. And when we read Scripture, we see that the term bread just was their term for a meal. They would say, let's break bread. And that meant to eat a meal. We will break bread. And any kind of side dishes that we would call them were supplementary to the bread. Now, they had a lot of grain, grinded up flour to make bread. It was coarse and tough bread. So with it, then they had their fruit or their vegetables or their meat, probably in a gravy, and all such as that. And their bread was the center of every meal. Whenever they began to eat, they didn't have knives, forks, and spoons like we have. We remember that growing up, our mothers taught us how to eat with a knife and a fork and a spoon. And sometimes us kiddos would get frustrated and eat with our fingers, and our mothers would tell us, don't eat with your fingers. And only fried chicken was allowed to eat with your fingers, and I was always glad about that. Because some people always said, well, fingers were invented before knives and forks, and that's true. But when they ate in that day and time, they didn't really have a lot of dishes, or place settings as we would call them. And they pretty well ate out of the serving bowls. They would put the bowls on the table and they would eat out of it. And what we call family style, I guess, these days. So we have to think about this. All right, if we had a bowl of mashed potatoes, a bowl of gravy, meat, chunks, and all that, if we all had spoons, we would dip and eat, dip and eat, and dip and eat, and that's not very sanitary. Well, okay, what if we didn't have spoons, but we had maybe pottery, a little dipper or pottery shell, maybe a seashell that we could use as a scoop to eat off of? That would be fine, but it's also not sanitary. So what they did, they had this really coarse, rough, tough bread, and the host of the meal would pray to bless the bread, and he'd break the bread. Hunks go here, hunks to there, and then as we ate, we would break off some and dip it in the bowl and eat it. Break off another hunk, dip it in this bowl and eat it. And that way it was sanitary. And we get the picture here. That's the way they did it. It's brilliant, given what they had and what they needed to do. This is the way they ate. And so whenever Judas received this bread from Jesus, that was the signification that, I'm picking you out. This is sort of what happened. Now we say this is so different. Yes, it's different, but each society has their customs on how they eat and all that. Have you ever seen anybody, or even a little video of anybody native to Japan eating with chopsticks? Man, they can eat as fast as we can. Even rice, that's what they live on, is rice. And they can take these two little sticks and eat with it. Because that's what they grew up with and learned. And so this is a little bit different for us, but this is what happened. Now, when it comes to bread, Jesus, when he broke bread for a meal, he always offered thanks first. That was their custom, of course. Even when Jesus fed the 5,000, it says, the little boy had the loaves and the fishes. Jesus took the loaves, and after he had offered thanks, he broke it and passed it out. And so their prayer over the bread, sort of assumed that everything else was blessed as well. And that's our custom. Before we eat, we offer thanks. We offer thanks, and then we break bread, whoever is the host or whatever. Now, when we see the Passover meal, this was very special because, the host was in charge of the ceremony that was supposed to happen for Passover. And they would start, and through this meal, they would have rituals. They would pass the cup of wine. They would pass it around 4 times. And this was all remembering the exodus of the children of Israel out of Egyptian bondage into freedom. And this cup, the cup of wine, first time we passed around, and there would be a little statement made and a prayer offered. This cup is the cup, the first time would be called one of sanctification, meaning God has chosen us and God's made us special, and let's remember that. And they pass the cup around and drink of it. And next cup, they said this cup remembers the plagues that God visited upon the Egyptians to show his almighty power, and they pass it around. Next time, the cup would be passed. This is called the cup of redemption, how God redeemed us out of Egyptian bondage. Passed it around. Lastly was a cup of praise to thank God for this. And they would have their prayer statement and pass it around. Now, in between all this, there were 3 times that they passed around bitter herbs. And this was on purpose to remember the bitterness of Egyptian bondage and the slavery and all the hard labor they had. So 3 times they passed some little bitter herbs that you really couldn't eat, but you tasted, and that reminded them, of course, of the bitterness of that. And then also in the ceremony of the meal of Passover, twice was unleavened bread passed around. And once in the middle and then once at the end. So whenever Jesus got ready to eat, and then they did, when Jesus took the bread and said, "Now this is my body," and he took the cup and said, "Now this is the blood of the covenant." This was part of the Passover meal. He might have done it, it says after supper, so he could have done it afterwards as well. But it was tremendously symbolic of their remembrance of coming out of Egypt. And it was just seeping with the beauty of God's deliverance and power. Jesus wanted to do this with his 12 before he died. And this is what happened. This was what was so good. And this was what was so important. Let me pause there just for a moment. Any comment or question on this? Yes, sir. John.
Talking about symbolism, which Jesus uses quite often.
Yes.
At the end of verse 30, my translation says, "And it was night." It could have just as well been translated as a time of darkness.
Yes.
I mean, this is the darkness is really going to come over the whole world. They're not going to be aware of it right then, but we are aware of it.
Yes. It was gloom. It was spiritual gloom. Yes, darkness. Okay, thank you. Absolutely. When we see this, we see Jesus in his emotions. Can you just imagine our Lord's feelings as this was going on? And so let's read just a little bit more in John chapter 13. This is verse 31. Let's read 31 to the end of the chapter. And this is about poor Peter. Poor Peter and what he says to Jesus. And when he was gone, Jesus said, "Now the Son of Man is glorified, and God is glorified in him. If God is glorified in him, God will glorify the Son in himself and will glorify him at once. And my children, I will not be with you I will be with you only a little longer. And you will look for me, but just as I told the Jews, so I tell you now, where I am going, you cannot come. A new command I give you, love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this everyone will know that you are my disciples if you love one another." And Simon Peter asked him, "Lord, where are you going?" Jesus replied, "Where I am going, you cannot follow now, but you will follow later." And Peter asked, "Lord, why can't I follow you now? I will lay down my life for you." And then Jesus answered, "Will you really lay down your life for me? Very truly I tell you, before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times." Here was Jesus telling his 12, actually the 11, because Judas had just left, God's going to glorify me, meaning the resurrected body after the crucifixion. And I won't be here very much longer. You need to love one another, and that's going to be the proof of your discipleship is if you love one another. I'm going to go. I'm not going to be around. And of course, they did not get it. And Peter said, as he always does, the first to speak, "Where are you going, Jesus?" And Jesus says, "Well, where I'm going, you can't come right now. You can come later." Of course, talking about his death. And Peter, of course, in good fashion says, "Well, I'll follow you anywhere. I'll lay down my life even for you." And Jesus says, "No, you won't, because you'll even deny me 3 times before the cock crows." And so here was the 12. Here was the 11, I'm sorry. And here's one of them had just left to betray. And poor Peter, as anxious as he was to help, still didn't realize that what Jesus was saying would come true just in a few short hours of him denying ever even knowing Jesus. Now Jesus has said over and over, "I'm telling you this ahead of time so that when it happens, you believe me that I knew what I was getting into." Here in John 13, verse 19, "I am telling you now before it happens, so that when it does happen, you will believe that I am who I am." This was a little section we didn't read, but in verse 19 of this chapter 13 of John, Jesus says, "I'm telling you this about the betrayal of Judas, so that when it happens later on, you can figure it out and you can remember, oh yes, Jesus said this was going to happen. That's right. He did know what was happening. And that just fortifies his divinity that much more." So this is the situation that Jesus is in. And our writer here, the Apostle John, he wrote earlier in his gospel, he wrote over and over again, Jesus had known from the beginning which of them did not believe and who would betray him. And he even asked his disciples, some of his followers were turning away from Jesus because they thought his demands were so hard. And Jesus asked his 12, do you want to leave me too? And then Peter said, well, no, Lord, whom shall we go to? You have the words of eternal life. And then Jesus replied, well, I have chosen you, the 12, but yet one of you is a devil. He says, and by this he meant Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, the one who was betraying him. This was earlier, way back earlier. Jesus had told the 12, yes, there's one of you here that will betray me. So let's never think this was not in the plan of God. Was this the way we would have done it? No. If we were writing a fairy tale, would we put this in? No. This is more proof of the divinity of Scripture when it shows things that are not logical and not mindful as we would think of how we would do it, but that one of the closest insiders of Jesus became his enemy and betrayed him. All right, our time is up. Any thought or question this morning? Dr. May.
I read a book once and I thought maybe someone can help me. I can't remember the author name, but his focus was on this week, and he kept saying, the betrayal, the Gethsemane and all that, he would think this was Thursday, but Sunday's coming.
Okay.
And as we study this, we lose it. As we stood today, the tomb remains empty.
Yes, the tomb remains empty. Absolutely. And we read about the 12 not understanding what Jesus meant about, Judas's betrayal and go do it quickly. They just didn't connect the dots. And would we have done any better? No, of course not. And so this is so fascinating to see God work this together. This very gloomy day, darkness just gets deeper and deeper until the crucifixion begins. All right, we'll continue a little bit about the Passover next week. Thank you very much.